He screamed as long as he could, until thick crimson liquid flowed from the stumps where his ears had once been, until his tongue, still alive, twitched at the executioner's feet like that of a dead fish. He screamed not with his mouth, but with his body, with the trembling of his bloodied fingers, with convulsive grinding against the stone slab. The king, chosen by right of blood, was dying on the floor of his own dungeon, his intestines twisted and tied in a knot around his throat. His name was no longer spoken aloud. The Chronicles compiled later wrote, "He." The church chronicles mentioned, "He who renounced grace." Town criers carried orders through the cities, burn his coats of arms, and seal his tomb without a name. Even the silver coinage had to be changed. The people refused to accept coins bearing his profile. However, the body disappeared before it could be buried. It all began in the summer, an ordinary summer, hot, stuffy, filled with gnats and bitter predictions. The court resembled a boiling cauldron. Bishops quarreled with the chancellor. The queen's children disappeared one after another. First the youngest, who drowned in a fountain, then the eldest, who did not wake up after liturgy. The wine was served diluted, and the bread was moldy. But the king ate, drank, and laughed. He had a peculiar laugh, sharp, cutting, like iron on glass. One of the pages once said, "When he laughs, it sounds like someone is sharpening a knife." Rumors of illness came a week after the next public execution. The body was not taken down from the gallows for 3 days. The king ordered it to be left there so that the birds might pray for the sinners. On the 4th day, it disappeared, and that same evening, the king vomited right at the table, a thick black mass with lumps of mucus and reddish streaks dripped onto the tablecloth. Everyone froze. Only he, wiping his mouth with a piece of bread, said, "Wine with meat." The next morning, he woke up with a fever. A doctor named Thibault wrote in his diary, "His forehead is hot as a blacksmith's forge. His pupils are dilated. The skin under his eyes is turning gray." He was placed in isolation in an old tower where prisoners had previously been held. By order of the chancellor, images of saints, a holy water font, and a box of consecrated salt were brought there. However, the king himself asked, "Take this away. Let the room remain silent." 2 days later, his neck began to swell. At first, it was barely noticeable, as if from a bite. Then it swelled rapidly to the size of a cabbage. He was suffocating. He spoke, but only wheezed. The maid, Jeanette, who came in with a decoction, later said, "He tried to speak, but only foam came out of his mouth, and laughter. I swear I heard him laugh, even when he didn't move his lips." His temperature did not drop. He sweated so much that the mattresses had to be changed 3 times a night. The doctors tried everything: opium, bloodletting, hot vinegar compresses. They put herbs under his tongue and poured oil into his ears. Nothing worked. His body seemed to be in disarray, continuing to live, but not in peace, but in convulsions and delirium. He shouted the names of the dead. He demanded leeches on his heart. He called for his son, who had drowned in a fountain. Once, in his delirium, he began to sing a hymn in a dead language that even the monks did not know. A week later, the first symptoms of decay appeared. A dark, damp spot appeared under his shoulder blade, like mold. Then on his thigh, the flesh softened, its color changing from red to greenish gray. The body emitted the smell of iron and wet wool. The doctors argued. One spoke of gangrene, another of a curse. A third, a blind surgeon, refused to enter the room, saying, "I can hear something breathing in there, but it's not a human being." The servants began to disappear. 2 of them, a brother and sister, were found dead in the basement with black spots on their lips. Another ran to the abbey, saying, "He sleeps with his eyes open. He can even see through walls." After that, the king was surrounded only by those who could not speak, deaf-mute monks and servants from the villages who did not understand speech. And at the door stood 2 armed inquisitors who had been given strict orders not to let anyone in without a sign. That same night, something flowed out of the king's body, as described in the report of the royal physician Arnu. A crack opened between the ribs and the thigh, from which a slimy bag with dense contents emerged. The smell was stronger than after the autopsy of a drowned man. The walls turned black. New measures were needed. The floor was covered with metal plates. The air was purified with smoke from resin. The king lay motionless, but he was still breathing, intermittently, with a wheezing sound, as if someone were blowing air into an empty shell. The skin on his face was tight, his cheekbones protruded, and his eyes were sunken. However, he was looking. He looked at everyone who approached, without even moving his pupils. One of the monks, who had made a mistake during the prayer, was found dead at the door. His ears were missing. The chancellor submitted a request for the temporary transfer of power, but the church remained silent. The cardinals argued, fearing a curse. Rumors spread that the king's voice could be heard at night, behind closed doors. He cannot speak, but the walls tremble. It only got worse. An ulcer opened under his left collarbone. From it, as described in a medical report, a semi-liquid mass emerged, in which something resembling the beginnings of tissue was found, like an unfinished fetus. It was burned in a furnace. The flames turned black. A crowd gathered outside the castle walls. Some demanded proof that the king was alive. Others prayed for deliverance. Preachers shouted, "If the king's flesh is rotting, then his sin has reached the throne." Several women doused themselves with oil and set themselves on fire. They cried out that they had seen angels retreating from the windows of the chambers. On the 3rd day after this, the cook was executed. He was accused of poisoning, but one of the priests whispered, "What can poison someone who is already dead?" The king stopped opening his eyes, but his lips moved. Flies began to emerge from the wound on his stomach. When they began to carry him away, he was still twitching. The executioner wrote in his memoirs, "We thought it was death, but it seems that death did not want to take him." His eyes were open, but they did not blink. Blood flowed from his ears, and dark clots baked in the corners of his mouth. His tongue was already lying in a bowl nearby, on an oiled cloth. One of the soldiers, on the orders of the chief guard, carried the body back to the dungeon, not to save him, but to let what had been started be finished. Orders came from above: do not touch, do not approach, do not mention. It was cold in the dungeons of the fortress, but the blood quickly dried. The body was stripped to the waist. Rats were touching his swollen and distended belly. One of the guards later testified in court. He was still warm. Alive, I don't know, but not dead. The smell was not that of a corpse, but of intestines, sweet, rotten, penetrating under the nails. A doctor, summoned secretly on the orders of one of the cardinals, examined the body and wrote in his diary, "The absence of a tongue does not prevent him from being silent. He does not whisper or growl, but we hear him in our heads." The diary was later burned. They began to cover the body with linen, but the bandages became damp from the inside. Murky pus with streaks oozed from the navel. Ulcers appeared in the armpits, from which dark mucus flowed. He was not fed, yet his stomach grew. One of the servants saw something long and narrow moving under the skin. He did not dare to say anything and ran away. He was never seen again. Those who were on duty at night noted that sounds were coming from the dungeon, not moans or rustling, but as if someone was scraping against the stone from inside. The stone under the body began to darken. At first, they thought it was blood, but blood does not foam. One of the officers wrote in his report, "What is coming out of him is not a substance, it is intent." The report disappeared. Instead, a new instruction arrived a day later. Seal the door. Do not let anyone in, even if he asks. 5 days later, his stomach burst open, not from the wound, but from the pressure inside. The stitches, made before the torture, came apart, and loops of intestines filled with a gray liquid protruded from the opening. Steam rose from them, like from hot dough. The medic who observed this described it. The loops were not empty. They were full of something that was moving. He was dismissed and sent to a monastery. The guards were changed every 2 hours, but not because they were tired. It was because no one could stand it any longer. Those who were on duty at night could hear dripping from his mouth. Although his tongue had been removed, his mouth was not empty. A gray mass formed inside the cavity. One of the monks who touched it got burns on his fingers. He was covered with blisters. At the trial, he later said, "It wasn't pus. It was like acid." According to the documents, he was still considered alive. On the walls of the fortress, people wrote, "The king breathes through the earth. He has no ears, but he hears. He is silent, but he calls." One of the interrogators who questioned the king's entourage said during the interrogation, "I saw his insides moving, not toward the exit, but toward his neck." He was found hanged, without a note. At that time, a rumor spread throughout the court that the body was a trap, that if it was burned, it would not produce smoke, but a voice, that his name must not be spoken, and that each of the executioners began to lose their hair. Later, it turned out to be true. One of those who held his hands later lost his sight. Another began to suffocate for no reason. A third disappeared. When the stomach was finally opened, all the organs were visible. They were not cut open. They came out on their own, either under pressure or of their own accord. The heart was still twitching. The lungs were not moving, but they were warm. One of the paramedics held a candle up to them. The flame went out. In his report, he wrote, "They weren't breathing, but they were pulling." This paper was not included in the archive. At the end of the second week, it was decided to embalm the king, as if in anticipation of his death. A man arrived from the monastery of St. Lawrence. He brought resin, salt, and a silver needle. But when he touched the body, blood spurted out, not red, but black, with thick clots. The master said, "I can't seal him. He hasn't been released yet." And he left. Then they wrapped the body in cloth. But the cloth tore, not from movement, but from pressure from within. One of the assistants tried to sew up the stomach, but the needle got stuck in the fibers of the skin. The blood vessels pulsed. When one of them burst, blood splattered onto the stone, leaving a mark like a burn. Rumors spread. People gathered at the gate. They said that it was not the king who was dying, but sin coming out. One of the excommunicated priests shouted, "He is a vessel, but not of water, of punishment." He was arrested. In his cell, he tore off his fingernails, scratching one word on the wall, "Inside." The king was still breathing when, on the 15th day, a rattle was heard from his throat. Not a moan or a breath, but a guttural crack, as if wet cloth were tearing inside his chest. One of the guards lost consciousness. Another dropped the keys and left without looking back. The note found in his room contained only 2 lines. "He is not dead. He has turned over." The guards were reinforced in the fortress. All approaches to the basement were blocked. The doors were sealed with lead, and rosaries consecrated in the temple were hung on the locks. The archbishop, summoned in secret, performed a purification ritual, but, as recorded in the report, the fire would not stay lit, the incense rotted, and the water in the bowl turned dark. Meanwhile, the body continued to change. Dark swellings, like bubbles, appeared on the neck. They pulsed, as if alive. One of the soldiers, unable to bear it, pierced one with a dagger. Steam burst out, along with a piece of fabric that looked like entrails. Decay began at the site of the puncture. A day later, the same area crumbled into black dust. Servants allowed inside by order of the council said that there was a constant moaning in the room. not a human voice. It was as if the stonework itself was breathing heavily. Some claimed to have seen the walls covered in sweat. An imprint formed on the bench at the head of the bed, as if someone had been sitting there all this time. New rumors spread throughout the palace. Some said that the king was cursed, and his soul could not leave his body. Others claimed that his soul had already departed, and what remained was nothing more than a vessel for another will. One of the holy fools prophesied, "He will open up from within like a book, and the name of the traitor will be written in his intestines." 2 days later, he was found dead in a well. Meanwhile, the blood in the body changed. During another attempt to open one of the sores, the knife slipped as if on stone. There was a crunch under the skin, as if a shell had burst. A mixture of black slime and white inclusions poured out. The surgeon's report states, the substance resembled a clot of tissue and fat, but there was movement in it, like a swarm of insects. On the 19th day, his chest collapsed. Without pressure, without external intervention, the bones, previously tense, cracked as if the internal framework had collapsed. One of the monks tried to read a prayer over the body, but lost his voice right in the middle of the psalm. He was taken to the monastery. Later, he wrote that he saw someone blink in the eye socket of the deceased. The entire medical council gathered and, at the insistence of the royal secretary, decided, there are no signs of life, but death has not been confirmed. None of those present dared to sign the conclusion. An attempt at embalming was repeated, but when they began to rub a mixture of myrrh and vinegar into the body, the skin began to peel off in layers. The flesh beneath it swelled, and one of the assistants cried out, "It's empty!" He threw down his knife and ran barefoot into the courtyard. He was later found in a barn, huddled in a corner and biting his fingers. Animals began to die near the body, first the rats, then the dogs that lived in the yard. Later, one of the horses broke free from its chain and threw itself into the ditch. When they pulled it out, foam was flowing from its nostrils, and there was a film over its eyes. The veterinarian wrote, "The animal saw something that is invisible to humans, and it could no longer see. The entrails lying on the stone began to decompose, but not in the usual way. There was no decay in the classic sense. They faded and shriveled, but did not rot." One of the craftsmen said, "It's as if they were burning from the inside." The stone beneath them became porous, and they tried to scrub it off, but the marks reappeared. The guards no longer approached the door. Food was left around the corner. No one knew why. The wine turned sour overnight. The bread molded. Once, a bowl of water was placed too close. In the morning, bloody streaks floated in it. An old servant who had served 2 rulers said, "Even lepers did not die like this. This is not a physical illness. This is exile." He was the only one who agreed to stay at the door. 3 days later, he disappeared. His robe was left hanging on a nail. Nothing else was found. Officially, the king was still considered in an unstable condition. His name was not spoken, and an empty chair was left in the council. One night, someone placed an intestine on the chair. No one confessed. The servant who discovered it committed suicide. On the wall, he left a message, written in charcoal. "He is looking for a throat." After 3 sleepless nights, the council secretary tore a page from the minutes and burned it in front of the cardinal. In his delirium, he whispered, "He has no tongue, but we can hear him." He was later declared incompetent, but before that, he managed to whisper, "He breathes with someone else's lungs." By the end of the 3rd week, the decay had reached his feet. The flesh was falling off. His feet were empty, and his fingers crunched when he tried to move them. But the body continued to pulsate in the abdominal area. One of the surgeons said, "I don't understand what is keeping this mechanism working." He committed suicide that same night. Servants began to pour lime under the door, but the stench did not disappear. Priests suggested performing an exorcism, but someone on the council said, "It's not the devil inside him. He has become what he feared." When the basement doors were forced open on the 31st night, none of the 8 who entered returned. Later, soldiers sent to look for them found the bodies, 2 with charred hands, 1 with black spots on his face, 3 with their tongues torn out. 1 was kneeling, his head buried in a stone slab, as if in prayer. The last one had no eyes. His empty sockets were filled with wax. They did not touch the body. They did not dare. He was described as an empty shell. His skin was stuck to his bones. His stomach was swollen like a bag. A piece of rib protruded from his neck. One of the priests, looking at him, said, "He is dead, but he is not left." Another added, "We will not bury him. We are closing." Mourning was officially declared. No mention of his name, no date of death. The following statement was read out. The transfer of the crown took place by the highest order. The throne is vacant. None of the dignitaries signed the document. Only the seal was uneven, as if pressed with a dead hand. The coffin had been ordered in advance, but by the time it was delivered, it was too small. The body had swollen. Fluid had collected inside. They transferred it to a wooden box lined with lead and poured resin over it. Before doing so, they cut the skin from the face to put on a wax mask. The mask cracked in the craftsman's hands, and he ran away shouting, "He's looking through it." The funeral took place at night. There was no one in the square. The ringing of bells was replaced by the sound of sticks hitting iron. Instead of a mass, there was silence. Instead of wreaths, there were stones. One child, seeing the procession, cried out, "He's coming back!" Later, he began to have convulsions. The coffin was lowered into an old burial vault under the chapel. It was left without an inscription. The stone was covered with salt and sealed. According to legend, one of the workers said, "We are not burying him, we are hiding him." He was found a week later, blind. On the same day, riots broke out in the city. There were 3 pretenders to the throne, the brother of the deceased, his son from his first marriage, and the widow's nephew. Each presented his own letter of authority. Each swore to his right. War broke out. One of the cardinals who supported the son died under strange circumstances. He vomited blood. An autopsy revealed a ruptured esophagus and something resembling hair inside his stomach. The second, who sided with the widow, disappeared. It was said that he saw something in the temple, after which he locked himself in a tower and never came out. Cries could be heard from there. The church was divided. Some claimed that the king's death was punishment from above. Others said that an ancient evil had taken up residence in his body. Some burned icons bearing his image. In monasteries, chronicles were rewritten, his name erased. A novice found dead at the altar had scratched with his fingernails. He asks to speak for him. Leaflets were distributed among the people. Decay is judgment. He is not dead. He is sharing himself. The king without a tongue cries louder than all. One of them was nailed to the doors of the temple with a piece of leather. No one confessed. On the 40th day after the funeral, cracks appeared in the tomb. The walls cracked and the plaster peeled off. The guards reported dampness. The stone turned black. Bricklayers were called. One of them wrote in his diary, "Something is pushing from inside. We patch it up, and it blows out." The council decided to fill the room with lead. It took 7 days. 5 people died during the work. 1 went mad, another went blind. A third stopped speaking. The last wrote on the wall, "This is not death. This is repetition." Soon, turmoil began abroad. The kings of neighboring states refused to recognize the new monarch. One declared, "I will not bow my head to one who has risen from decay." Strife began. Embassies were recalled, and the alliance collapsed. According to the Chronicles, the world turned away from the throne as from a plague. In one of the treatises written years later, it was noted, "Thus ends a dynasty that began with blood. It was not death that destroyed it, but the inability to die. Another text found in the archives said, "He did not want to be a god, but he became someone whom people fear more than the devil." Peace did not come. Infants continued to die in the city. The water in the wells turned murky. Dogs lost their teeth. Pregnant women's hair turned gray. Locals whispered, "He has returned in the flesh." Several years later, a priest from a neighboring diocese arrived and performed a blessing ceremony in the square. A stone collapsed beneath his feet. Below was emptiness. No one dared to go down. According to reports, there was a foul smell in the air and handprints on the walls. On that day, a black circle appeared in the sky. It is recorded in the monastery chronicle, the day when no one spoke, but everyone heard. Thus ended this reign, not in glory, not in oblivion, but in fear that permeated the walls. His name is not spoken, but a new prohibition appeared in some prayers. Do not let him in, even if he knocks from inside.